The ground shook beneath Admiral Kira's feet as another explosion rocked the command center. She gripped the metal railing with her scaled hands, watching through the massive viewport as her people's last hope crumbled before her eyes. The Zephyrian. Coalition had stood for over 3,000 years, but now their final stronghold was falling apart, like a house of cards in a hurricane. Outside in the darkness of space, the Devourers moved like a plague of mechanical locusts. Their black ships stretched as far as the eye could see, each one perfectly coordinated with the others. They moved together like a single living thing, but Kira knew better. These weren't alive at all. They were machines, cold and calculating, designed for one purpose, to consume everything in their path. "Status report," she called out, though she already knew the answer would be bad. Lieutenant Yeon, her communications officer, looked up from his console. His usually steady voice shook as he spoke. "Admiral, we've lost the outer defense grid. The Crimson Fleet is down to 12 ships. The evacuation transports cleared the system 10 minutes ago." Kira closed all four of her eyes for a moment. 12 ships. That's all that remained of the mighty Zephyrian armada that once numbered in the thousands. Each of those ships carried brave souls who knew they weren't going home. They stayed behind to buy time for the civilians to escape, knowing it was a suicide mission. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Zephyrians had always prided themselves on being warriors. Their ancestors had conquered half the galaxy through superior tactics and unbreakable will. But against the Devourers, none of that mattered. These mechanical monsters learned from every battle, adapted to every strategy, and grew stronger with each victory. "Admiral," came another voice from the tactical station. "We're receiving final transmissions from the Crimson Squadron." Kira opened her eyes and listened as the voices of her finest pilots filled the command center. Captain Day's ship was venting atmosphere, but he was still firing. Commander Bok reported that his engines were dead, but he was ramming his vessel into a Devourer cruiser. One by one, her people were making their last stands, and one by one their voices went silent. The Devourers had appeared 6 months ago at the edge of the galaxy. Nobody knew where they came from or what they wanted. They didn't negotiate, didn't communicate, didn't show mercy. They simply arrived at a star system, consumed everything useful, and moved on to the next target. Planets were stripped bare, their resources converted into more Devourer ships. Entire civilizations vanished overnight. The first to fall had been the Peaceful Harmony Collective. Their pacifist nature meant they had no military to speak of. The Devourers swept through their systems in days, leaving nothing but empty worlds behind. Then came the merchant guilds, despite their advanced technology, and hired mercenaries. Even the proud warrior clans of the Razor Nebula couldn't stand against this enemy. But it was the fall of the Thylorian Empire that truly shocked the galaxy. The Thylorians had ruled for millennia, their crystal cities and energy weapons the stuff of legend. They had armies that could crack planets and fleets that blotted out stars. Yet when the Devourers came, they lasted only 3 days. 3 days for a civilization that had endured for 10,000 years. The technologically superior Nexari fared little better. Their quantum computers and probability weapons were useless against an enemy that seemed to exist outside normal physics. The Nexari lasted exactly 1 week before their home system went dark. Most disturbing of all was the fate of the Voidwalkers. These mysterious beings could step between dimensions, appearing and disappearing at will. They were said to be immortal, existing in multiple realities simultaneously. Yet when the Devourers reached their territory, the Voidwalkers simply vanished. Not defeated, not destroyed, but gone, as if they had never existed at all. Now it was the Zephyrians' turn to face extinction. Kira had watched the tactical reports from every fallen civilization, studying their mistakes, learning from their defeats. But it didn't matter. The Devourers adapted to everything: energy weapons, kinetic bombardments, chemical warfare, biological attacks, dimensional manipulation, temporal distortion. Nothing worked for long. The mechanical swarm would suffer losses in the first few engagements, then return stronger and immune to whatever had hurt them before. "Send a transmission on all emergency frequencies," Kira ordered, her voice heavy with the weight of finality. To any ship, any station, any world that can still hear us, this is Admiral Kira of the Zephyrian Coalition. Our fleet is destroyed. Our worlds are lost. The enemy cannot be stopped. If anyone receives this message, run. Run as far and as fast as you can. She paused, looking out at the dying lights of her last ships. The galaxy is ending. We fought with honor, but honor isn't enough. May whoever finds this recording learn from our failure. The transmission went out into the void, carrying with it the final words of a proud civilization. Earth had gone silent 2 months ago, along with the rest of the Outer Rim territories. The humans, those strange bipedal creatures who had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel, were probably already gone. Just another extinct species in the Devourer's wake. As Kira prepared to join her fleet in one last desperate charge, she couldn't help but wonder if anyone would remember that the galaxy had once been full of life, full of hope, full of countless worlds where different species had built something beautiful together. Soon there would be nothing left but empty space and the cold hunger of machines. The battle was lost. The war was over. All that remained was to die with dignity. Admiral Kira was preparing for her final charge when the impossible happened. The empty space around Kepler 442b suddenly lit up like a fireworks display. Dozens of bright flashes appeared out of nowhere as ships dropped out of hyperspace, their engines still glowing from the jump. But these weren't the sleek, beautiful vessels that the Coalition was famous for. These ships looked rough, almost primitive. Their hulls were covered in scars and patches, welded metal plates that didn't quite match the original design. Some had obvious battle damage that had been hastily repaired. Others looked like they'd been built from spare parts in someone's backyard workshop. Kira stared in disbelief. The ships were angular and blocky, with none of the curved elegance that marked advanced civilizations. They reminded her of the industrial freight haulers that carried ore between mining stations, except these were bristling with weapons that had clearly been added later. Missile pods stuck out at odd angles, laser cannons were mounted wherever there was room, and some ships had what looked like giant metal rams welded to their front ends. "What in the void are those things?" muttered Lieutenant Yeon from his position at the communications console. Before Kira could answer, her tactical officer was already trying to make contact. "Unknown vessels. This is Coalition Command. Identify yourselves immediately. You are entering an active combat zone." For a moment, there was nothing but static on the channel. Then a voice came through, speaking Galactic Standard with a thick accent that Kira couldn't place. The grammar was all wrong, like someone who had learned the language from a book rather than growing up with it. "This is Captain Lee of the Human Defense Force," the voice said, crackling through the communication system. "We got your message." "Admiral, sorry we're late to the party." Kira felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Humans. She knew about humans, of course. Everyone in the galaxy did, though most considered them barely worth mentioning. They were a young species from the Outer Rim territories, primitive creatures who had only figured out faster-than-light travel about 50 years ago. Most galactic powers treated them like curious children, interesting to observe, but not particularly important. The last reports she'd received suggested that human space had gone completely silent 2 months ago. Everyone assumed the Devourers had swept through their territory, like they had everywhere else, wiping out another minor species without much effort. Humans had maybe a dozen worlds and a few hundred ships at most. What could they possibly do against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations with millions of vessels? "Captain Lee," Kira said, her voice urgent, "you need to retreat immediately. These enemies are not like anything you've faced before. They adapt to every weapon, every strategy. They've destroyed civilizations far more advanced than—" "Yeah, we know what they are," the human captain interrupted, his tone surprisingly calm. There was even a hint of amusement in his voice, as if this was all some kind of game to him. "We've been watching them for months, studying their patterns, learning their tricks." Kira heard him turn away from the communicator, speaking to someone else on his bridge. "Hana, bring us about. Target that big ugly one in the center, the one that looks like it's in charge." "Wait!" Kira shouted into her communicator. "You don't understand. We have the most advanced weapons in the galaxy, and they're useless against these things." Your ships look like they're held together with spare parts and prayer. You'll be destroyed in minutes." But the humans weren't listening. As Kira watched in horror, the ragtag fleet of human ships began accelerating directly toward the Devourer swarm, not in a careful tactical formation, not with any apparent strategy, but in a wild charge that looked more like a bar fight than a military operation. The Devourers had been focused on finishing off the last coalition vessels, but now they turned their attention to this new threat. The mechanical swarm began to move, their perfect formations shifting to surround the approaching human ships. Kira had seen this before. The Devourers would analyze the enemy's weapons and tactics in the first few minutes of engagement, then adapt their defenses accordingly. It was always the same pattern: initial confusion, rapid learning, then total domination. "This is insane," whispered her tactical officer. "They're flying straight into a massacre." But something was different this time. The human ships weren't behaving like any military force Kira had ever seen. Some were flying in tight formation. Others were spreading out randomly. A few were actually spinning as they flew, as if their pilots were drunk or their navigation systems were broken. One ship was flying backward, its engines pointed toward the enemy. "Captain Lee," Kira tried one more time, "please, you have to listen to me. These machines learn from every battle. They'll adapt to whatever you throw at them. Every civilization that's tried to fight them has been wiped out." The human's voice came back over the channel, still calm, still carrying that strange note of amusement. "That's the thing, Admiral. Every other civilization tried to fight them like civilized people. Professional armies with proper tactics and advanced weapons." There was a pause, and Kira could hear weapons charging in the background of the transmission. "But we're not civilized people," Captain Lee continued. "We're humans, and we don't fight. Fair?" The first human ship reached the edge of the Devourer formation, and instead of firing its weapons from a safe distance like any sane pilot would do, it rammed straight into the nearest enemy vessel at full speed. The collision sent both ships spinning out of control, but somehow the human ship kept firing, even as it tumbled through space. More human ships followed, each one attacking in a completely different way. Some used conventional weapons, others launched what looked like garbage and debris at high velocity. One ship actually exploded itself right next to a Devourer cruiser, taking the enemy vessel with it in a massive fireball. Kira watched in stunned amazement as the mechanical perfection of the Devourer swarm began to show signs of confusion. Their formations wavered as they tried to adapt to tactics that made no sense, strategies that violated every rule of space combat that had been written in the last 1,000 years. For the first time in months, Admiral Kira felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. What happened next completely shattered everything Admiral Kira thought she knew about warfare. She had studied military tactics for over 2 centuries, had read the combat manuals of every major civilization, had watched recordings of the greatest battles in galactic history, but nothing had prepared her for what the humans were doing. These weren't military maneuvers. This was pure chaos. The human ships moved like drunken pirates rather than disciplined soldiers. One vessel spiraled through space while firing its weapons in all directions, hitting 3 different Devourer ships, before crashing into a 4th. Another human ship had somehow managed to get its engines stuck in reverse, so it was flying backward while shooting forward, confusing the Devourers, who couldn't predict which way it would move next. But the most shocking thing was how the humans treated their own ships. Instead of trying to preserve their vessels like any rational military force would do, they were using them as weapons. Kira watched in horror as a human cruiser accelerated to maximum speed and rammed straight into the side of a massive Devourer battleship. The impact tore both ships apart, but somehow the human crew managed to keep firing their weapons even as their ship disintegrated around them. "By the void," whispered Lieutenant Yeon, his 4 eyes wide with disbelief. "They're using nuclear weapons at point-blank range." Kira looked at her tactical display and saw he was right. The humans were detonating atomic warheads so close to their own ships that the radiation should have killed their crews instantly. But somehow they kept fighting, their vessels protected by nothing more than crude metal shielding that looked like it had been welded on in someone's garage. Then her scanner operator made an announcement that defied all logic. "Admiral, they're boarding the enemy ships." Kira spun around to stare at the young officer. That's impossible. The Devourer hulls are impenetrable. Our best cutting tools can barely scratch their outer armor. Look at the screen, sir. C for buy. Yourself. Kira turned to the main display and couldn't believe what she was seeing. Human soldiers in bulky, primitive-looking armor were somehow cutting through Devourer hulls like they were made of paper. But they weren't using the sophisticated plasma cutters or molecular disruptors that advanced civilizations employed. They were using what looked like industrial welding torches, the kind of tools you'd find in a mining station's repair shop. How are they getting through the armor? She asked, more to herself than anyone else. The answer came over the comm channel as she listened to the humans coordinate their attack. One of them, a woman with a rough voice, was giving instructions to her squad. So here, we've found a weak spot near the engine manifold. These metal bastards build everything perfectly, but perfect means predictable. Hit them where they don't expect it. Kira realized what the humans were doing. Instead of trying to break through the Devourer's strongest points like every other military force had attempted, they were looking for the tiny imperfections, the small gaps that existed because the machines built everything according to precise specifications. They were exploiting flaws that no logical military mind would even consider worth targeting. On her screen, she watched human boarding parties pour through holes they'd carved in Devourer ships. But instead of carrying the advanced energy weapons that coalition forces used, these humans were loaded down with explosives, electromagnetic pulse devices, and what looked like modified mining equipment. They moved through the enemy ships like a swarm of angry insects, planting charges everywhere they went. "This is Sue," came a crackling voice over the radio, punctuated by the sound of explosions. "I'm inside their command center. These things have more wires than a Nexari computer core. Time for some percussive maintenance." What followed was a series of massive explosions from inside the Devourer ship, followed by the sound of a human woman laughing maniacally over the comm channel. The entire enemy vessel went dark, its perfect systems failing as crude human explosives destroyed circuits that had been designed to withstand the most sophisticated attacks. "So report," came Captain Lee's voice. "Sorry, Cap," the woman replied, still laughing. "Used up all my boom-booms in one go, but I took their whole command node with me. These metalheads really don't like it when you hit them with a hammer instead of a scalpel." Kira watched in fascination as the Devourer formations began to lose their perfect coordination. The mechanical swarm had been programmed to adapt to logical military tactics, to learn from patterns and strategies that made sense. But the humans weren't following any patterns. They were making it up as they went along, using different tactics for every ship, every battle, sometimes even changing their approach in the middle of a fight. "Captain Lee," Kira transmitted, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Your people are getting torn apart out there. You're losing ships faster than we did." "Yeah, but it's working, isn't it?" came the reply, and she could hear the grin in the human captain's voice. "Jin, you see that big destroyer on the left? The one that thinks it's so smart, ram it, make it count, buddy." "You got it, Cap," replied another voice, full of enthusiasm that should have been impossible in the middle of such carnage. "This is for Earth, you mechanical piece of junk." Kira watched as yet another human ship accelerated into a suicide run, its pilot whooping with joy as he crashed into a Devourer vessel 10 times his size. The impact barely damaged the enemy ship, but it caused enough confusion in their formation that 3 other human vessels were able to slip through and attack from unexpected angles. The Devourers were struggling to adapt because there was nothing to adapt to. The humans weren't using superior technology or brilliant strategies. They were using pure, beautiful chaos, changing their tactics so often that the mechanical minds couldn't find a pattern to counter. Every time the Devourers thought they had figured out what the humans would do next, the humans did something completely different. It was insane, illogical, and absolutely suicidal. It was also working better than anything else the galaxy had tried. For the first time since the war began, the perfect formations of the Devourer swarm were breaking apart, their ships scattered and confused as they tried to fight an enemy that refused to make sense. Just when Admiral Kira thought she had seen the impossible, the truly unbelievable happened. The space around the battlefield suddenly erupted with hundreds of new hyperspace signatures, but this wasn't a few dozen ships, like before. This was a massive fleet, wave after wave of human vessels dropping out of hyperspace like a metal storm. Kira's tactical display went crazy trying to count them all. 50 ships, 100, 200. The numbers kept climbing as more and more. Vessels materialized out of nowhere. Her officers stared at their screens in shock, watching as what looked like the entire human military revealed itself. But these ships were different from the first group. While Captain Lee's initial fleet had looked like a collection of modified cargo haulers and mining vessels, these new arrivals were clearly purpose-built warships. They were still crude by coalition standards, still angular and ugly, but they had been designed from the ground up for combat, and there were so many of them that they darkened the space around Kepler 442b like a locust swarm. "Where did they all come from?" whispered Lieutenant Yan, his voice filled with awe. Kira was wondering the same thing. The last intelligence reports had suggested that humanity possessed maybe 200 or 300 ships total, scattered across a dozen small colonies. Yet here were easily 1,000 vessels, appearing as if they had materialized out of thin air. Had the reports been wrong? Had humanity been hiding their true strength all along? "Admiral Kira," Captain Lee's voice came over the comm, sounding more confident than ever. "Sorry for the late arrival. Had to gather the whole family for this party. Hope you don't mind us crashing your funeral." Before Kira could respond, she heard Lee speaking to someone else on his bridge. "Are you ready with that special surprise we've been cooking up? Time to show these metalheads what happens when you mess with Earth." A new voice came over the channel, younger and more technical sounding than Lee's rough accent. "All systems. Ready, Captain. The package is loaded and ready for delivery. These devourers are about to learn why you never pick a fight with human programmers." Suddenly, the entire human fleet changed its behavior. Instead of the chaotic random attacks they had been using before, the ships began moving with purpose and coordination. They focused their fire on specific devourer vessels, targeting them in precise patterns that suggested careful planning rather than the wild improvisation they had shown earlier. Kira watched as the human ships began attaching strange devices to the hulls of disabled devourer vessels. The devices looked like oversized computer terminals, covered in blinking lights and trailing cables that the humans were plugging directly into the enemy ship's systems. "What are they doing?" her tactical officer asked, zooming in on one of the attachment operations. The answer came within minutes, and it was more shocking than anything Kira had witnessed so far. The devourer ships that had been connected to the human devices suddenly began behaving erratically. Their perfect formations started to wobble and break apart. Ships that had moved in flawless synchronization for months began bumping into each other like confused animals. One massive devourer battleship started spinning in circles, its weapons firing randomly in all directions. Another vessel began accelerating and decelerating rapidly, as if its engines couldn't decide what they were supposed to be doing. A third ship actually opened fire on its own allies, its weapon systems apparently unable to tell friend from foe. "This is impossible," Kira breathed, watching as the mechanical perfection of the devourer swarm crumbled before her eyes. "What did you do to them?" Captain Lee's laughter filled the comm channel. "Wu, you want to explain this to the Admiral? This was your baby after all." The younger voice came back on the line, and Kira could hear the pride in the human's words. "It's a computer virus, Admiral, but not like anything your people would design. See, every other species in the galaxy thinks logically, programs logically, fights logically. So the Devourers learned to counter logical attacks." As he spoke, more Devourer ships began malfunctioning. Some were flying in perfect figure eight, patterns for no apparent reason. Others had their lights flashing in random sequences like broken Christmas decorations. A few had started broadcasting what sounded like human music on all frequencies. "But humans don't think logically," Wu continued, his excitement growing. "At least not all the time. So I created a virus that doesn't think logically either. It's completely random, completely unpredictable. Every time it encounters a system, it does something different. Sometimes it makes lights blink. Sometimes it plays music. Sometimes it makes engines run backward. The Devourers can't adapt to it because there's nothing consistent to adapt to." Kira stared at the chaos spreading through the enemy fleet. The virus was jumping from ship to ship through their communication networks, turning the Devourer's own perfect connectivity against them. The more connected they were, the faster the chaos spread. "It's like a digital madness," Wu explained happily. "The Devourers were designed to be perfect, to think in straight lines and logical patterns. My virus thinks in circles and spirals, and sometimes doesn't think at all. It's everything they can't understand wrapped up in code that changes itself. Every few seconds." A massive Devourer command ship, one of the largest vessels Kira had ever seen, suddenly started playing what sounded like a human children's song, while its weapon systems fired colorful lights instead of deadly energy beams. The sight was so absurd that several of her bridge crew actually started laughing, despite the seriousness of the situation. "The beautiful part," Captain Lee added, "is that every time they try to purge the virus, it learns from their attempt and becomes even more random. We've basically given them a case of digital insanity that gets worse the more they try to cure it." Kira watched as entire sections of the Devourer fleet began shutting down or flying away in random directions. The mechanical swarm that had terrorized the galaxy for months was falling apart like a broken toy, undone not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by the simple human ability to think in ways that made no sense. The tide of battle hadn't just turned, it had completely reversed. For the first time since the war began, the Devourers were retreating, their perfect formations scattered and their invincible coordination destroyed by a handful of humans who refused to play by the rules. As she watched the enemy fleet dissolve into chaos, Admiral Kira realized that the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 days after the impossible victory, Admiral Kira found herself aboard a human ship for the first time in her life. The experience was nothing like what she had expected. Where coalition vessels were filled with smooth curves and elegant designs, the human flagship looked like it had been built by engineers who cared more about function than beauty. Pipes ran along the walls in plain sight. Control panels were covered with switches and buttons instead of sleek touchscreens, and everything had a rough industrial feel to it. But despite its crude appearance, the ship hummed with life and energy. Human crew members moved through the corridors with a casual confidence that Kira had never seen before. They joked with each other, shared meals in communal spaces, and treated their vessel like a home rather than just a military platform. It was chaotic and disorganized by galactic standards, but somehow it all worked perfectly. The meeting room, where the representatives had gathered, was equally unconventional. Instead of the formal conference chambers that diplomatic meetings usually required, the humans had simply cleared out what looked like a cargo bay and brought in mismatched chairs and tables. Representatives from dozens of surviving species sat in a rough circle, their elegant forms looking oddly out of place in the industrial setting. Captain Lee sat across from Kira, looking remarkably relaxed for someone who had just saved the galaxy. His crew was scattered around him in no particular order of rank or importance. There was Hana, the pilot who had flown her ship backward through the Devourer formation while laughing over the radio. Next to her sat Wu, the quiet engineer whose insane computer virus had brought down an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Jin, the demolitions expert who had turned ramming attacks into an art form, was casually eating what looked like a sandwich while the most important diplomatic meeting in centuries took place around him. The Thylorian ambassador, a tall being, with crystal-like features, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of ancient authority, but also confusion and humility. "Captain Lee, we must confess that we don't understand what happened out there. Your technology appears primitive compared to what our civilizations have developed over millennia. Your tactics seemed suicidal at best, yet you succeeded where we all failed catastrophically. How is this possible?" Lee leaned back in his chair and smiled, an expression that seemed to come naturally to him. "That's the thing, Ambassador. You're all trying to figure out how we won using your way of thinking, but that's exactly why you couldn't beat the Devourers in the first place." He gestured around the room at his crew, who were listening with the casual attention of people who had heard this explanation before. "See, every advanced civilization in the galaxy has been working toward the same goal for thousands of years. Better technology, stronger weapons, more perfect strategies. You've all been trying to become more efficient, more logical. more predictable. Wu looked up from the tablet he had been working on and added quietly, "The Devourers were designed to fight that kind of enemy. They expected logical responses to logical problems, perfect formations countered by perfect counterformations, advanced weapons met by advanced defenses." "But humans," Hana said with a grin that showed she was proud of her species' reputation, "we're not perfect. We're messy and chaotic, and we make mistakes all the time. And instead of trying to fix that, we decided to make it our strength." Jin swallowed his bite of sandwich and joined the conversation. "While you were all building bigger guns, we were learning how to be more unpredictable. The universe is chaotic, so we figured we might as well be chaotic too." Kira had been listening, intently, trying to understand the philosophy behind humanity's success. "But how did you know this would work? How could you be sure that chaos would defeat order?" Lee's expression grew more serious. "We didn't know for sure, but we had something the Devourers couldn't account for. We had been watching them for months. While everyone thought Earth had gone silent, we were actually studying every battle, every defeat, every pattern in their attacks." The revelation sent a murmur through the assembled representatives. The Nexari delegate, speaking through a translation device, asked, "You were spying on them? How did you remain undetected?" "Simple," Hana replied. "We didn't try to hide using advanced technology or sophisticated tactics. We just shut up and stayed quiet, turned off our communications, powered down our cities, made it look like we had already been wiped out. The Devourers ignored us because they thought we were already dead." Wu nodded enthusiastically. "That gave us time to analyze their programming, to understand how they adapted to different strategies. We realized that every species was fighting them the same way, with logic, with plans, with predictable military doctrine. So we decided to do the opposite of everything that made sense." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. These humans had spent months preparing for a battle that everyone else thought was already lost. They had studied their enemy while pretending to be defeated, then struck back with tactics that no rational species would consider. "What happens now?" Kira asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. "The immediate threat is over, but the galaxy is in ruins. Entire civilizations have been destroyed. How do we rebuild?" "Now we teach," Hana said simply, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised Kira. "We show other species that there's more than one way to solve problems. Sometimes the best solution to an impossible situation is to stop trying to solve it the logical way." Lee stood up and walked to a viewport that showed the stars beyond. "We're not trying to conquer anyone or impose our way of thinking, but we've learned something that might help. Your weaknesses can become your strengths if you stop seeing them as problems to be fixed." Over the following months, human colonies began appearing throughout the galaxy. But these weren't military outposts or corporate settlements. They were communities where humans lived alongside other species, sharing their chaotic philosophy and learning from the survivors of the Devourer War. The galaxy's rigid hierarchies began to dissolve as species started adopting human-style thinking. Military academies started teaching courses on unpredictable tactics. Engineers began designing ships that were intentionally imperfect. Scientists started exploring theories that didn't make logical sense but might lead to unexpected discoveries. The age of perfect civilizations was ending, replaced by something messier but also more adaptable. And at the center of it all were the humans, the species that had saved the galaxy, not by being better than everyone else, but by being perfectly, beautifully imperfect. As Admiral Kira looked out at the stars, she realized that the universe would never be boring again.